Hello, I'm Jennifer Casler Price, curator for Asian, African, and Ancient American art here at the Kimbell Art Museum. And it's my pleasure today to lead you on a tour of Queen Nefertari's Egypt. We have here a wonderful image of the beautiful Queen Nefertari. It's from one of the murals that decorated her tomb. But who was Queen Nefertari? Well, alongside such celebrated queens as Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, and Cleopatra, we also have the wonderful Nefertari. Now, all of these queens were from the New Kingdom period in Egypt. This dates from 1539 to 1075 BCE. And the New Kingdom period represents the very height of Egyptian civilization, of culture, politics, artistry. This is a period that dates about 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids in Giza were built. Now, during the New Kingdom period, one of the greatest pharaohs was Ramesses II. He reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE. And he was not only one of the greatest, but he was one of the most powerful and prolific pharaohs during the New Kingdom period. This was due to the many military campaigns that he conducted during his reign. And through these campaigns, this brought many material goods and items from tributaries all around his kingdom. This allowed him to build many grand monuments and temples. And one of the grandest temples that he built was the Greater Temple at Abu Simbel and the Lesser Temple at Abu Simbel. The Greater Temple was dedicated to himself and the god Horus, and the Lesser Temple was dedicated to his beloved Nefertari and the goddess Hathor. Nefertari was one of Ramses II's 8 wives, but she was his favorite. She was the first royal spouse. She was the most beautiful. In fact, her name means beautiful companion. And one of the things that set Nefertari apart from the other wives was that she was literate. She could read and write hieroglyphs. And so she was able to aid her husband in his diplomatic missions. Now, when Ramses came to power, he and Nefertari took several expeditions around the empire. And in this way, she became acquainted not only with politics, but with the people of Egypt. So again, this really sets her apart. And to her, he built this grand temple at Abu Simbel. Now, we didn't know much about Nefertari before the early 1900s. We knew of her from some inscriptions and from her image on the temple at Abu Simbel. But in 1904, Ernesto Schiaparelli, who was then director of the Museo Egizio in Turin, made the great discovery of her tomb in the Valley of the Queens. And what he discovered was a tomb that was one of the largest and most resplendent tombs that had ever been discovered. Now, in addition to the tomb being large, it was also covered in fantastic murals. And these murals depicted the perilous journey that Nefertari had to make through the underworld in order to reach the afterlife. So the fact that the tomb was so large, the murals were there, and also the few things that were left remaining in the tomb. The tomb had been looted in antiquity, but there were a few things remaining that also gave an indication of how important Nefertari was to Ramesses II. Now, another discovery that Schiaparelli made was the artisan village of Deir el Medina. This was a village that was located in between the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And this was home to the artisans who built the royal tombs. Now, it's very unusual to have the remains of a domestic village. And so that really makes this discovery important. What Schiaparelli was able to bring back to Italy were the objects, materials, and goods from daily life that surrounded these artisans that built the royal tomb. So it really gives us an insight into the lives of the common people in Egypt. So there's two components to the exhibition. There's the royal component and the common component. And all of this is seen through the eyes of Nefertari and through the eyes of the women of the New Kingdom period in Egypt. So please follow me while I lead you on a tour back into time, into ancient Egypt. Now, we were talking about Ramesses II. The pharaoh, of course, was the most important figure in Egyptian culture. He was the spiritual, the judicial, and the political leader of Egypt. Egyptians turned to him for guidance. They also turned to him to be able to communicate with the gods. The Egyptians lived with many forces that they didn't understand, many kind of natural forces that were frightening, earthquakes, floods, drought. And in order to deal with these forces, they developed an expansive pantheon of gods and goddesses who they believed controlled these forces. And they believed that through giving offerings and through ceremonies, and through building temples to commemorate these gods and goddesses, they could ask for their help on a daily basis in controlling these forces. It was up to the pharaoh, who was also considered a living god. He was the embodiment of the god Horus on earth. It was up to him to also communicate with the gods. He was the intercessor between the gods and humans. And it was his duty every day to go to the temple and to awaken the god, to bathe the god, to feed the god, to anoint the god, and to give offerings to the god. And in this way, the pharaoh kept the world from going into chaos. It was up to him to keep order and balance and harmony and justice in the world. So he's a very important figure to the Egyptians. Now we have a wonderful sculpture here right in the center of the gallery, this triad of Ramesses II in the center, and he's flanked by the great god Ammon, the god of the sun, and Ammon's consort, the goddess Moot, who is the great mother goddess. Now, what do we see here? We see that all three are the same size. So that means that the pharaoh is as important as the gods. We also see that the pharaoh is outfitted in several accoutrements that kind of identify his power and authority. We have another image in the gallery of another pharaoh, Thutmose I, one of the earlier pharaohs in the New Kingdom period. And when we look at both of these images, what do we see? We see that they're wearing a striped headcloth known as the Nemes headcloth. And on the forehead is a cobra. And the cobra is there to represent that he spits fire at his enemies. Then also on Ramesses II, we see that he's wearing a crown. The crown is a sun disk that is adorned with 2 ostrich plumes and ram's horns. The god Ammon also wears a crown with stylized ostrich plumes, and the goddess Moot wears a sun disk crown with the horns of a cow. So with this sculpture, we see that the pharaoh, again, is on the same level as the gods and goddesses. Now, to assert his power and authority, but also to have a relationship with the gods, the pharaohs built great temples. They built temples in honor of themselves. They built temples in honor of the gods. The mural that you see behind you on the wall, that is the lesser temple of Abu Simbel. That is the temple that Ramesses II built in honor of his beloved wife, Nefertari. It's next to his temple that's built to honor himself and the god Horus. Inscribed on the temple is a saying, "The one for whom the sun shines." And this indicates that Nefertari was, again, so beloved to him. He felt that she was so beautiful that the sun rose every day to illuminate her beauty. Now, talking about gods and goddesses in Egypt, as I mentioned, they created a big pantheon of gods and goddesses that ruled different aspects of nature. Now, we have benevolent gods and we have fierce gods. And one of the most fierce goddesses is Sekhmet, the lion goddess. She is the goddess of divine wrath. We see that she has a lion head. There's many gods and goddesses in Egypt that have animal attributes. And they take on those attributes of animals to help kind of explain their powers. So we have Sekhmet. She is the daughter of the sun god Ra. And as such, she exemplifies the power of the sun, which can be both punishing and beneficial. We can see that her mane actually looks like the rays of the sun. She's wearing a wig, which most Egyptian women also wore. And she holds in her hand the Ankh, which is the hieroglyph for life. So she can take life away and she can also give life. Now, it was very important to keep Sekhmet at bay, because if she sort of ran amok, she would reap scourge upon the land. She would make the Nile dry up and burn all the crops. And so it was very important to keep her placated. To that extent, the Egyptians prayed to her every morning and every night to ask for her blessings and also to keep her in her domesticated form, which was the cat goddess Bastet. If we come over here, we see a couple of other images from the temple of Amenhotep III. This is a temple that was built about 100 years before the reign of Ramesses II. And in this temple, we know that there were at least 300 of these monumental sculptures that were recovered from the temple. We presume that there were probably 365 of them, since the image of Sekhmet had to be prayed to every day of the year. But we have 4 of these grand images here in the exhibition. They are absolute masterpieces of the collection of the Museo Egizio in Turin. So with that, we'll leave the pharaoh behind, and we'll leave the temples behind, and we're going to enter into the world of ancient women in Egypt. Now, some of you might be interested to know that in ancient Egypt, women actually had equality with men in the sense that they could own property. They could run their own businesses. They could stand up in a court of law. If they got divorced, they actually got to keep their property and their belongings. But that said, women still were primarily tasked with domestic duties, with the duties of taking care of children and with housekeeping. And this extended to both commoners and royals alike. Now, the pharaoh had many, many wives and many, many children. And this was a way for him to, again, express his power. It was a way to have diplomatic alliances, and it was a way to ensure his progeny. So in the Egyptian palace, you had the place where all the women and children lived, the women's palace, that was separate from where the pharaoh lived. And you can imagine, with all the wives and children's and diplomats' children, it was a very large and lively place. There was a strict hierarchy between the women. And then it was also overseen by men, by administrators and scribes and butlers who helped take care of the women. So what would you find in the women's palace? Obviously, we have wonderful examples of different types of vessels, musical instruments, sculptures, amulets. And one of the most important components also in ancient Egypt is music. And women played a big part in music in Egypt. Music was played in the women's palace, but also women played musical instruments in religious processions. And this was a way that they were able to participate in the religious ceremonies in ancient Egypt. Now, as we look at some of the musical instruments and some of the sculptures, we see the face of a woman. And actually, this is the face of the goddess Hathor. She is probably the most well-known, the most beloved, the most important goddess in the whole Egyptian pantheon. She was beloved by commoners and queens alike. And in fact, the queen was considered the divine aspect of Hathor on earth, just as the king was considered the divine aspect of Horus, her husband. We see here an image of Hathor. The animal that she is related to, her spirit animal, I guess you could say, is the cow. The cow represents motherhood, fertility, celestial beings. And so Hathor is often shown with the face of a woman, but with cow's ears. And then she also wears a very stylized wig known as a Hathoric wig. It looks a little bit like the character of Marlo Thomas from That Girl. That's what it kind of reminds me of. And so we have many depictions of the goddess Hathor as we go through the women's palace. Other important things that we see in other important goddesses are goddesses such as Tauret. We have these wonderful little faience amulets and another sculpture here of Queen Ta as the goddess Tauret. Who's the goddess Tauret? She is another goddess that takes on the attributes of animals. She is shown as a pregnant hippo. She has the tail of a crocodile and the feet of a lion. These are all animals that are known for fiercely protecting their young. So Tauret protects pregnant mothers, protects children, and encourages fertility. As we move through the galleries, we see other images of women that you might have found in the temple or in the palace. We have a beautiful stone sculpture of the goddess Moot. Again, we saw her earlier in the Triad with her consort Ammon and with the pharaoh Ramses. Moot is really considered the mother goddess. She embodies all those qualities that the ideal Egyptian woman would want to aspire to. She's a dutiful wife. She's a wonderful mother. She's nurturing. And we see that this is carved in stone, just as the monumental sculptures were. But we don't just have stone sculpture in Egypt. We actually have sculpture that was also carved from wood. And these sculptures are just as important as the stone sculptures. And in a way, I think they're even more beautiful, because when you think about how difficult it is sometimes to carve wood, also the fact that the wood had to be brought in from the Mediterranean, it wasn't natural to Egypt. And we have a couple of examples here, again, of the types of women that you might see in the royal palace. The statuette of an elegant lady who's wrapped in a wonderful shroud and a long skirt, wearing her wig that is much like the Hathoric wig, her beautiful face rimmed with kohl, and then a small image of a young girl. We know that she's a young girl because she's not wearing any clothes. She just has jewelry and she has a short little wig on. Two really beautiful examples of wood statuary. We'll see a few more examples later in the exhibition. Now, as we go through the gallery, we have other things that we would have found that surround the women of ancient Egypt. One thing that's very important in Egypt is beauty. Both men and women beautified themselves with cosmetics. Cosmetics served two purposes. One, of course, was to beautify oneself. If you were beautiful, and also cleanliness was very important, that reflected balance and harmony in your life. Also, cosmetics served a medicinal purpose. In ancient Egypt, obviously, we didn't have modern medicines, and we had a very harsh climate, the harsh rays of the sun, the dust, the dirt. And in order to protect the eyes, men and women rimmed their eyes with kohl. When we think of depictions of Egyptian women, think of Cleopatra, and she has those wonderful black kohl-rimmed eyes. Well, kohl is actually the mineral stibnite. It was ground up and it was mixed with animal fat so that it could be applied around the eyes. And this actually protected the eyes from bacterial infection and protected the eyes from the harsh rays of the sun. We have a wonderful example of a kohl tube. See here in a yellow faience, and it has an inscription on it, and it's the inscription of another queen, Ta, a queen that also lived around the time of Nefertari. It still has the applicator in the tube, and this is a very precious object because it is inscribed. It may have been a gift from her husband, the pharaoh. It was also included in her tomb. So what's important to note is that many of the objects that we see in these cases that relate to cosmetics or relate to jewelry were also found in the tombs of the Egyptians because they needed to take these things into the afterlife with them. And we'll talk a little bit more about the afterlife in a moment. But you had to be beautiful not only on this earth, but you needed to be beautiful and to be clean in the afterlife, again, to reflect balance and harmony and perfection. We have some wonderful cosmetic spoons that are carved out of precious materials such as alabaster, but also wood. These would have held colorful powders, face powders, eye makeup powders, all ground from minerals, and again, all helping to protect your skin from the harsh rays of the sun. As we move down, we also have examples of jewelry. Adornment was very important to the Egyptians, but it also served another purpose. It was magical and protective. The Egyptians wore all kinds of jewelry that was festooned and adorned with magical amulets. it's also, we see two necklaces that are made out of carnelian, which is an orange-red stone that represents life and blood and the flesh. We have amulets that are adorned with little ointment vessels that would have had precious perfumes in them, and the Ujjayi eye of the god Horus, who lost his eye in a fight with his uncle Seth, and then his eye was restored by Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. And so this is a protective eye that we see in jewelry, and we'll see in other places on carved monuments in Egypt. Then we have a necklace made out of faience, which is this blue material. It's a silica, and the color of faience, the turquoise blue, had magical properties to the Egyptians as well. They felt that it represented the brilliance of eternity. It represented the water of the Nile, and hence life and regeneration. And so we have many things that are made out of faience in Egypt, different types of jewelry, necklaces, rings, and then later on we'll see some shopties. So again, moving through the gallery, just finally we have some other wonderful containers for perfumes. Perfumes were not alcohol-based, they were cream-based. They took fragrant flowers and spices and wood resins and ground them up and mixed them again with animal fats and oils. And then they put them in these precious containers, some of them made out of beautiful glass that probably would have come from the Mediterranean, beautiful carved alabaster containers. This one is particularly nice. It has two containers for the kohl that you use to rim your eyes, and then this little bulbous container that would have held precious creams or unguents. Again, these help to moisturize and protect the skin. And then there's a little hole that would have held the applicator for the kohl. Now, we talked a little bit about religion in the royal aspect of life, but religion infiltrated every part of life in Egypt, both royal and commoner. Now, everyone in Egypt did follow the same gods and goddesses. They prayed to the same pantheon, but in certain areas of Egypt that weren't near the ancient capital of Thebes, they also praised local deities, deities that meant something special to them. Here we have another example of a beautiful carved wooden sculpture of the queen Amos Nefertari. This is a queen that lived 300 years before our Nefertari. She was the first queen of the New Kingdom. And Amos Nefertari and her son, who was the pharaoh Amenhotep, were the ones who actually founded the artisan village of Deir el-Medina that I mentioned earlier, the village where all the craftsmen who built the royal tombs lived. And Amos Nefertari was very important in Egypt. She was very wealthy. She gave a lot of money to temples. She gave a lot of money to the commoners. And so when she died and her son died, she and her son became the deified god and goddess and patron saints of the artisan village of Deir el-Medina. Again, just pointing out the wonderful headdress that she's wearing. It's a feathered headdress. The wig, most Egyptian women wore wigs, and this beautiful dress that's composed of an upper cape that sort of drapes her arms and then flows down and really hugs every contour of her body. There's a little hint of her belly button there. And as static as the sculpture is, and she's looking straight forward, you can see that her eyes are rimmed in kohl that I talked about earlier, but her left leg is just slightly forward. It gives her a little bit of movement and kind of imbues her with a spirit that brings her to life 3,000 years later. So as we enter into the village of Deir el-Medina, the artisan village, we see in this gallery, there are several examples of funerary stele, and then we have other examples of ostraca. So I mentioned earlier that in Deir el-Medina, they had their own religious practices, but they also followed the religious practices of the pharaohs and the queens. And one of these was to carve funerary stele. And these would be included either in the tombs of the deceased or in chapels that were that you would go into at the entrance of a tomb, or in a home chapel where the living could make prayers to the deceased. And so on the stele of the artisans of Deir el-Medina, we see images of Amos Nefertari. Here we have a wonderful image. She's seated on a throne. She's at left in the top register. We have an artisan named Pembui who is making offerings to her. And we see the lotus and we see a water pot. The lotus is a symbol of regeneration and rebirth. So very important in terms of wanting to be reborn in the afterlife. And we see that he's bowing to her. And behind her, we see carvings of 2 ears. These are the ears of Amos Nefertari, and she is hearing the prayers of the artisan Pembui, who is asking her to help him on his journey through the underworld and to be reborn in the afterlife. Now, some of the other things that we see here in the gallery are fragments of limestone. Now, the stele that I was just mentioning, these are carved out of big slabs of limestone. And you can imagine, as the workers are carving these stele, there's chips and flints of limestone that are kind of falling off. Now, artisans in Deir el-Medina worked under an apprenticeship system. So they made copies in order to learn their trade, in order to know how to make the paintings and the tomb murals for the great pharaohs and goddesses. And so they needed to practice. And these limestone chips are known as ostraca. And these are literally the sketch pads of the artisans of Deir el-Medina. And so you can imagine that you've got a pile of these limestone fragments and you need to make a quick sketch. You need to figure out how you're going to paint a barge or paint the image of a deity or paint the image of a sacred animal such as a bull. And so you pick up a limestone chip and you just quickly make a sketch and then you throw it away. They literally threw these sketches away. And so when Schiaparelli was excavating Deir el-Medina, he found thousands and thousands of these ostraca just piled up in a trash heap. And thankfully, he retrieved these ostraca. He didn't throw them away. He didn't disregard them. He saw how important these were because in these, you really see the hand of the artisan. There's something that's so kind of immediate about them and so fresh and so free. And again, you really get the sense of the hand of the artisan when you look at these wonderful ostraca. So as we move further into the village of Deir el-Medina, we see a large table here. We call it our workers' table. And this includes all the different kinds of implements that would have been used by the artisans who were creating the tombs of the pharaohs. Now, when a pharaoh came to power, he immediately started working on his tomb, his mansion of 1,000,000 years, his house of eternity. And so you would have a group of workers, about 60 workers, who would immediately start to literally dig the tomb out of the side of a cliff. And then they would go in and they would scrape down the walls and smooth it down, stucco the walls, then paint it with murals that depicted scenes from the underworld and scenes of the afterlife and paradise, scenes that would help the deceased make their journey to be reborn with Osiris. So we have such implements as hammers and chisels, more examples of ostraca, of sculptures, busts, and again, more wonderful examples of these funerary stela. Now you have to remember that the artisans of Deir el-Medina in the New Kingdom period are going to be of the highest quality. These are really the craftsmen of the highest level. So not only are they in the employ of the pharaoh, but the things that they make for themselves are also of the highest quality. And that also really is quite amazing about this village and the fact that we still have these things today, because there are not very many domestic villages that have been excavated. These were villages that were made out of mud brick and have not stood the test of time. So here we have another large stela, and here we can see it's divided into 3 registers. It still has a wonderful amount of pigment left on it. It's carved and painted. And normally what you have is on the top register, you have deities from the underworld. So here you have Osiris. You see that he's wearing the crown of Egypt, the Atef crown of Upper Egypt that's adorned also with 2 ostrich plumes. He's holding the crook and the flail. These are also symbols of the pharaoh, and he's wrapped as a mummy. Now, why is he wrapped as a mummy? So the story of Osiris is that he was torn apart by his brother Seth and his sisters Isis and Nephthys, along with Nephthys' son Anubis, the jackal-headed god, literally stitched him back together, put him back together with bandages, and regenerated him and brought him back to life. And so Osiris becomes the god of the underworld and the god of the afterlife. So in all of these funerary monuments, we normally see images of Osiris. We often see images of Anubis, who was known, jackals were known for habiting cemeteries. Their dark skin is a reflection of the mud of the Nile, which is also a symbol of regeneration. We see the worker Naki, and we know that it's Naki because the hieroglyphs tell us the name of the worker. And he's making offerings to Osiris, again, asking for safe passage through the underworld in order to be reborn into the afterlife. We have images of fruits and foods and drink and water and lotuses, again, a symbol of regeneration. So Naki gives offerings to the gods of the underworld. And then Naki and his wife are receiving offerings from their children. Their son is a priest. He's wearing a panther skin. That's how we know that he's a priest. And on the table again, we have offerings of food and drink, and we are purifying the offerings with water. And then another procession of Naki's children bringing more offerings. As we move around the table and move around the gallery, we have a mural here in the back. This shows the excavated site of Deir el-Medina. We can see that it's quite large. It had about 60 houses that were excavated. We see wonderful vessels here from everyday life. We have beer jars and amphora that were used in cooking, but also wonderfully decorated vessels, beautifully painted, that were used for holding drink and food. Again, the high level of craftsmanship and artisanship in Deir el-Medina. One of the more fascinating things, I think, again, are the implements that were used by the craftsmen, by the scribes. Scribes were very important in Egypt, obviously. We see, carved all over these stelae and written on papyri and also on the ostraca. We see hieroglyphic inscriptions. And so you had scribes who could read and write. And we have here a wonderful wooden scribe's palette. You see little circular containers that would have held the ink, and we still have the reed pens that would have been used to inscribe papyri and to be used in painting ostraca. We have another example of a stela here, examples of Egyptian blue pigment. The bowl would have been used to grind the pigment and mix it with water. And then we have brushes that would have been used to paint the tomb murals. So again, it's really amazing that we still have these implements that were used 3,000 years ago. As we come around, we see more examples of the funerary stelae that were found in the workers' tombs. And again, we often think of Egyptian art in terms of just royal art, because mostly that is what has been excavated from ancient Egypt. But this is the art of commoners, and yet at the same time, it's art on the highest level. We have furniture fragments that would have come from a tomb. All of these also come out of tomb contexts. So the Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, which was essentially, the afterlife was the same as life on earth, but it was better. It was like a paradise. And you would need all the things in the afterlife that you would have used in this life. So all types of food and beverage and implements and vessels and furniture and shopti. These are all included in the tombs of Egyptians, commoners and royals alike. Here, one of the most humble things that we have are workers' tools, hammers and chisels. You can think about the really back-breaking labor that it took to carve out these tombs from the sides of cliffs using just wooden mallets and copper chisels. If you look at the mallets, you can see that actually there's an indentation going around the circumference of these mallets. That's the indentation from the constant hammering on the chisels. And then you see that the handles are kind of shiny. This is from the hand of the worker that held this hammer, that used this hammer to bang on the chisels 3,000 years ago. Again, bringing to life the workers of Deir el-Medina. One of the other things included in the tombs of both commoners and royals are shopti. I think many people are familiar with shopti. These are the little workers that are going to accompany you into the afterlife. Work was very important to the Egyptians. They were not lazy. It was really important that you worked in this life and you worked in the afterlife. And so in the afterlife, you would have little helpers, little shoptis. And oftentimes they're holding implements, they're holding hoes, and they have little baskets on their back. We can see these are painted, beautifully painted, with inscriptions. They're all inscribed with the names of the owners. These are all workers from Deir el-Medina. And also they have spells from the Book of the Dead. And these are spells that would be recited in the afterlife, and it would animate them and bring them to life so that they could work for the deceased. So as we move into the next room, and again, talking about the afterlife, what other types of provisions would you have? Again, looking at shoptis that are made out of faience. I mentioned earlier, faience was considered a magical material. It reflected the brilliance of eternity in the tomb. It was reminiscent of the Niles of the waters of the Nile, the blue water. And these are shoptis from the pharaoh Seti I. He was the father of Ramesses II, so another very important pharaoh. We have the headrest. It was very important to protect the head, in fact, to protect the whole body. This was why the Egyptians practiced mummification. You needed to preserve the body so that when you reached the afterlife, you could reunite the body with the soul and be reanimated. So you had to protect the head. You also had to protect the heart with little scarab amulets. The scarab beetle represents the sun god, the rising sun of Khepri. And so the scarab amulets would protect the heart of the mummy in the tomb. And should something happen to the heart, the scarab amulet then was a substitute for the heart. We also have wonderful examples of smaller statuary in the tomb. Here is a wonderful example of a couple. Normally you have a married couple of a male and female. These are two females. We don't know who they are. We don't know if they're sisters. We don't know if they're a mother and daughter or friends, but we can see that they're tenderly holding each other. And the woman on the right is in the position of honor. That's the traditional position of honor. And there is an inscription on the side that basically says, "Please let my daughter be reunited with Osiris in the afterworld. Please give her safe passage." So, like everyone else, Nefertari also had to make a journey through the underworld in order to reach Osiris. And to this extent, Ramesses built her a resplendent tomb, one of the largest tombs in the Valley of the Queens. We have a mural here. This is just a reproduction of a mural from her tomb. And this is the goddess Maat. Maat is the goddess of justice and balance and harmony. And Moot is very, very important in the journey that you have to make to reach the afterlife. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We also see a hieroglyph here that has the name of Nefertari. And we have these all over her tomb. Now, the tomb itself obviously is still in Egypt, and the wonderful murals that decorate the tomb are still there. But of the treasures that were left in the tomb, we have everything here, almost everything here in the exhibition. So let's go around the corner. And when Schiaparelli discovered the tomb in 1904, the tomb had already been plundered in antiquity. So there are only a few things that were left remaining. One of them was the great pink granite stone sarcophagus lid that covered her coffin. And we have here a wonderful model of the tomb that was made just shortly after the tomb was excavated. This is a 1/10 scale model. It's a wonderful historical model. And Schiaparelli's team, members of his team, made very intricate drawings of all the murals in the tomb so that they could make this model. And it represents the journey that Nefertari makes through the underworld to be reunited with Osiris in the funerary chamber. We see that it is 2 levels, and she had to travel from the upper chamber down through the stairs to the lower chamber so that she could be reborn with Osiris. We can see the 4 columns here. We've represented them here in the gallery, and adorning the columns, we see the Jed Pillar. What is the Jed Pillar? That represents the backbone of Osiris. It represents stability, and also it represents regeneration. So what did Schiaparelli find in the tomb? We can see that the sarcophagus lid was violently broken in order for the tomb robbers to get in and get the valuable goods inside. We can presume that probably her coffin was covered in gold, and maybe she had a mummy mask that was gold. So they took anything that they thought was of great value, but they left a few things behind. And 2 of the most kind of touching things and interesting things are a pair of her sandals and her mummified knees. Now, the sandals to me are really touching and really exquisite. I'm a flip-flop girl, so if I were going to the afterworld, I would certainly want my sandals with me. But again, it's such a humble object. And when you think that the queen might have worn these herself. And in fact, there's a tomb mural image in the tomb of Queen Nefertari seated, playing the game of Senet, and she's wearing the same sandals. The mummified knees, when we look at the proportions, scientists estimate that Nefertari was about 5'5", 5'6". She was about 80% taller than most of the women of her time. She had arterial sclerosis, so she was probably between 40 and 60 when she died. And the sandals are size 9, women's size 9. So she was quite a presence, let's say. We don't really know what her origin is. We don't know if she was from Egypt. We don't know if she was from a foreign land. But this gives us some indication of who she was and her stature. And again, it's just this very, very personal item that comes to us today and brings her to life for us. So as we go around, we see some of the other things that were found in the tomb. We talked about shopties earlier. Obviously, Nefertari would also need to have shopties in her tomb. These are 34 that were recovered from the tomb. They're covered in a black resin called bitumen. They're inscribed with her name and also with the spell from the Book of the Dead that would help to animate them. And then one of the most precious things found in the tomb, one of the few things left behind by the tomb robbers, this wonderful little Jed Pillar Amulet. I mentioned before the Jed Pillar represents the backbone of Osiris and hence stability and regeneration. Here it is in amulet form, made of gold and blue faience to imbue it with magical properties, and it is inscribed with Nefertari's name on the back. And it was the only object in the tomb that was actually found in the same place that it was when the tomb was constructed. It was found in a little niche in the tomb. Maybe the tomb robbers missed it, but it comes to us today. And again, it just hints at what must have been in her tomb and all the treasures that must have been there. The fact that her tomb was so large, the fact that it was adorned with all of these fantastic tomb murals that helped Nefertari to navigate her way, her perilous journey through the underworld in order to get to the afterlife, in order to be reunited with Osiris. And so as we leave Nefertari, we go into the final part of the exhibition, and we talk a little bit more about that journey through the underworld and the afterlife. And we're now going to go to a period that's about 500 to 700 years after the time of Nefertari. There's one more discovery that Schiaparelli made when he was excavating in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. He found two other tombs of two princes of Ramesses III. And in these tombs, which had also been looted, he found over 40 coffins that were piled up in these tombs. Now, these coffins came 500 to 700 years after the time of Ramesses III. So the tomb had been plundered, left empty, and then been reused. Now, in talking about the journey through the underworld, I mentioned earlier the goddess Moot, the goddess of justice, harmony, balance. She's the goddess that also ensures that we don't have chaos in the world. To help us on our journey, to help the Egyptians on their journey, they had the Book of the Dead and the Book of the Underworld. Many of these books were inscribed on papyri. We see here, the spells were also painted on tomb murals, and then we'll also see that they are painted on the covers of the coffins. But here we have one of the stories of one of the trials that the deceased has to undergo. So here we have Moot and Isis. Moot has a feather in her cap. Here's the deceased holding his hands up. The deceased's heart has to be weighed on a scale against Moot's feather. If the heart is heavier than the feather, that means that the deceased has committed many sins. His heart is not pure. He will not reach the afterlife, and it will be devoured by the beast Ammon. If the heart is not heavier than the feather, then the deceased gets to join Osiris and live an eternal life with Osiris in the afterworld. So all these wonderful figures, we have Anubis, the jackal-headed god, the god of mummification. We have Horus, who's the falcon-headed god. He also represents the pharaoh. We have Thoth, who's the ibis-headed god. That is the god of wisdom and writing. He's marking down the result of what happens with the weighing of the heart. We have other gods and goddesses that inhabit the underworld. And then here we have Osiris again with the crown of Egypt, holding the scepter and the crook, and seated on a throne and wrapped as a mummy. We have another papyri here that tells another story that relates to the sun god Ra. We see the sun god here in a royal barge. He has the head of a ram. Remember that Ra is also connected to the pharaoh. Ra has to undergo a journey of 12 hours through the day and 12 hours through the night. In that nighttime journey, in the last hour, he has to pass through the body of a snake. The snake is a demon. He has to successfully pass through the body of the snake, and we have all kinds of helpers here. And as he passes through, he is reborn the next day as the sun. Here's Khepri, the sun god, as the scarab beetle. He leaves behind Osiris, the god of the underworld, and he is reborn again. The pharaoh makes this journey with the sun god Ra, and so both of them are reborn every day. And so the sun comes up every day and regenerates life again. As we come through the gallery, we can see these wonderful examples of wooden coffins, again, that are coming from a period of about 2500 BC. I'm sorry, that's not correct, 500 BC. And we can see that they're painted with wonderful designs. Again, these are all representing the denizens of the underworld. We have Osiris, Anubis, Isis, Nephthys. We have spells from the Book of the Dead to help the deceased on his journey. You know, the process of mummification was a very arduous one. The body had to be washed. The organs were taken out. It was dried. It was wrapped up. It was put inside of a wooden coffin, sometimes inside of two coffins. Then the coffin was placed in a sarcophagus, and then the provisions of for the afterlife were also placed inside. We often see on these coffins also the image of a winged deity, a female, and that is the sky goddess Nut. She is the goddess of the night sky, and she protects the body of the deceased so that the body can be reunited with the soul when it reaches the afterlife with Osiris. So as we walk down the gallery, we can see the covers of coffins, we can see the bases. And when you come to the exhibition later, I encourage you to also look inside. You can see that they're also painted inside with images of gods and goddesses, with the sun disk, with Osiris, beautifully painted, beautifully decorated. We have an example of a coffin that, again, is one of these multiple kind of component coffins. These types of coffins that we see here are called anthropoid coffins. That is because they are in the shape of a human. We can see that they're all have the face of the deceased. The eyes are open so that they can come to life in the tomb. And here we have, again, a beautifully painted base. There's a false mummy cover that would cover the mummy, and then the cover on top of that. And then finally, just to show you one more example, again, with the imagery that we find on these coffins, with the sky goddess Nut opening up her feathered arms to welcome the deceased into the afterlife. Other denizens of the afterlife, we have Horus, Anubis, Thoth, and the deceased as a mummy being surrounded by Isis and Nephthys, the two goddesses that brought their brother Osiris back to life. On the back of the coffin, we also see a beautifully painted image of Isis, and just looking at the line drawing here, it's so exquisite. The relationship between the drawing and the hieroglyphs, again, really the height of artistic quality. So thank you for joining me today on a tour through Queen Nefertari's Egypt, and I hope that we'll be seeing you here at the Kimbell Art Museum very soon.